Yep.
Ah, oh, good. Okay. This is my first Zoom of the morning, and so all of my stuff has been unplugged and made confusing, but now we're in action.
Awesome. Great.
It's like
Cool.
it's always the first Zoom of the morning that's like messed up, and then you've got this you got everything wired together properly.
It's amazing how that happens on a daily basis, right?
Yeah. No, it is. I have gotten more efficient, I feel like, with the Zoom setup. It's just,
Wait, Sam,
save a
have
lot
you
of
got a separate camera going on, or like a
yes.
whole setup? Okay, that looks really good
Yeah,
with the blur.
I figured that if I was going to be stuck at home for months, I'm a tinkerer, and so I'm like, I obviously have to figure out how to make this as complicated as possible. And then and then two, yeah, I overinvested uh in complicated Zoom setups um to look slightly more realistic so I don't, look crazy.
We appreciate it. Um,
Yeah,
awesome,
nice.
Sam. Thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for taking the time. Happy to be here. Fan of your program.
Awesome. Us too, right back at you. So we just as for pioneers who have not done AMA before, essentially how this format will work is if you have a question, let me know on the right, put it in the chat. You can send me a message privately, and I will put you in a queue that everyone will see. When we do go to you, please just introduce yourself really quickly, where you're from, where you're recording from, and also just maybe a sentence or two about what you're working on. That way Sam just has some context.
Cool.
Perfect. I think, with that, Sam, maybe we start with an intro and some background, and then we can get straight into questions.
Background on me. Yeah, look, I mean, I've been very fortunate in life. Worked pretty hard too, but I've done a bunch of stuff. People I have a 3-year-old, and my wife recently asked because she's a journalist. My wife asked, and he knows that. She asked, "What do we explain your job is?" And I was like, "Whatever you want." Like, I'm a builder, I guess. I don't know. My career was I started at a consulting firm for a few years called Bain. This is like over a decade ago. Left. I was like, "This is terrible. What's the opposite of this?" With respect to my friends at Bain. Started a company, built it. It was a file sharing platform. We were like an early AWS user. Sold it to Facebook, was VP of product there for a bunch of years. Through going public, ran identity and privacy and a bunch of really cool product teams on the engineering design product side. Left when it got really big, and huge respect for those guys. But have kind of since then, since about 2014, doing like 2.5 things. One is I'm one of the 3 general partners at a firm called Slow Ventures. We have about $500 million under management. We do early stage investing, seed stuff, A's, et cetera, on all sorts of cool technologies across consumer and B2B stuff and whatever. Done a bunch in crypto. Second is like, look, I love building. I actually think building is like where you learn the most and also have the most impact. With respect to investors, I feel like you can do a lot of good there, but really the action is in all forms is building. So for the last bunch of years, I've been building a company, which is what I spend probably the majority of my like chronological time on. With a buddy, Andrew Cortina, who founded Venmo. I had been Venmo's first investor, so he and I kind of splintered off, and we're building what's become a very B2B focused company that helps teams manage large operations teams efficiently. So we basically help I'll just say it's basically New Relic for people, right? If you guys know New Relic, in terms of doing performance monitoring down to like the click-stroke level, and then using that to optimize process and people and how teams are working to make them more efficient. And then I do a bunch of writing, which I love doing. My wife founded a publication called The Information, which is a subscription-only, basically news service in Silicon Valley. They do really hard-hitting news and have for years with a great community around them. I kind of write opinion columns because they let me. So I don't know. I'm not sure what my job is, but I do lots of stuff in the tech industry. How's that?
That's awesome. That's perfect.
All right, cool.
Cool. First up, we have Jay.
Yes. Hey,
Hey,
Sam.
Jay.
So
That looks like a
my
nice
name
beach
is,
you're on there.
I know this is the dream if I could be outside right now. So first off, I'm joining BCG in September. So love the intro on Bane and how you hated
Cool.
it.
Look,
Maybe
I
that's
think
how it's
I
gonna
think
be.
I'm being a little bit flippant, actually. Like, obviously, we can get more into it. I don't actually hate consulting firms. I learned a lot there. I got, but it's very, let's just say it's a very different lifestyle and approach
Oh
to
yeah,
things than being a builder.
100%. I think I'm trying to do a few years there and then quit afterwards.
Yeah,
But
a lot
anyway,
of great people did that. I can go my Bain class. Was just an incredible set of entrepreneurs, which we can get into. Like, it was
oh,
just
that's awesome.
unbelievable. There was like 7 people, and everyone founded companies, and a lot of them have been hyper successful.
That's awesome. Okay, good to know. Good to know. My question was, so I was reading a bit before about you before this AMA, and I saw the article on TechCrunch about the beginnings of Fin, right? The personal assistant thing.
Yeah,
And I'm imagining that's how you guys switched from that to B2C, right? To B2B, right? Just by
basically, yeah.
monitoring the human assistants. Can you talk to me how and why you switched from B2C to B2B?
Yeah, so when Cortina was at Venmo because I'm sorry, was at PayPal because Venmo had been sold, and I was at Facebook, and we were both ready to go do an entrepreneurial thing together. And I've always felt like you only get so many opportunities after college to work with friends, and so we kind of did this exercise of like, what do we want to work on? And we're very, very, very. This is a bunch of years ago, like, so things have kind of evolved since then, but we're super skeptical on pure AI as we are today. Like, we think AI and people selling it kind of bullshit, right? It's more marketing than reality. It's just fancy machine learning. And like, there are places it's really valuable, but like the idea that there's going to be some magical black box that does everything is just wrong, right? We were super
100%,
interested
yeah.
in how machine learning changes operations work and human knowledge work, right? Which we think will be a dramatic shift in the future. And so we started out doing a very second time entrepreneur thing, right? Which is, you said, screw it, we'll just build everything ourselves from the ground up. We'll pick a target, which is a thing we kind of want, which is like a amazing assistant that can do broadly everything. Everyone told us, which they were right, that it's like too broad a target, there's no service to build. But we were like, yeah, we know that. But the reality, like, it's not news to us, but the reality is what we want is a general purpose human in the loop assistant. And we think that if we go off and try to build it, we'll discover all the problems with that, and we'll build all the infrastructure ourselves. Again, don't do this as a first-time entrepreneur. You probably don't even want to do it as a second-time entrepreneur, but it's like an interesting way to force yourself to discover the real problems with systems. And so we went off and built this. We got it to work. It was scaling. There are people who loved it. Like, we probably could have built the operations team out significantly. Like, we had like 100 operations. They'd probably go to 1,000 or 10,000, and you could have had an okay business. But it's brutal. Like, these types of businesses are just brutal to operate for all sorts of reasons we get into. And we actually kind of figured the big thing out, which was we had all these people. We had built all this software. We were trying to figure out how to optimize the system overall. And you have incredible instrumentation of the technology. And then you turn around and say, I have hundreds of people doing tasks. I have no idea what they're doing. I have no insight into their process. And so until I have that process insight at scale continuously, I have no ability to optimize the overall system. And so we started building our own tools to figure out what the people were doing all the time, what best practice was on every single subtask, where things were fast and slow and efficient and inefficient, and then using that as like a core data set to drive exactly what features we were developing and how we were changing process. It works, right? Like, once you have every click stroke plus effectively full video and audio recording, and you can zip around the data set, and you can build the queries you need against it, and you can measure how things are changing over time, you can get super dialed, right, in like how you manage your operations team. Turns out that like there's literally like $1 trillion of ops spend, customer service, back office, all this stuff, and no one has these tools, right? Like, at best they have like basic outcome statistics, and we're like, wow, this is like a really good company. Like, a lot of people need this. And so we basically started productizing that, and that's kind of become what the company is. So again, the way we approached building Fin was like a little self-indulgent, honestly, because we were like, well, we can kind of take the time and space to go build everything and like figure it out and kind of wander our way through. We did it pretty intentionally. I would not suggest it as a good way to like be a sole founder from zero starting a company. But it is like how you find cool shit is like you have to kind of go deep on it and waste a bunch of time, I would argue, in like a thing no one else gives a shit about, right? In order to find the most interesting opportunities, right? Is the way I think about it, right? Like, I just don't think you can kind of intellectualize your way into these problems. You have to feel them, right?
Got it.
So that's kind of the thing. I mean, it's like, it's funny, the question is, people are like, oh, how do you guys pivot? And it's like, sort of. I mean, it's like kind of a matter of opinion, right? Like, we ran a very interesting early project, right? Which helped us figure out what we thought was like the commercializable component of it. But yeah, I mean, like, people just approach this stuff differently. The stories, like, a lot of great companies come out of like evolutionary processes of people screwing around, right?
It does seem very organic how it went from monitoring potential internal operations to just productizing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, there's nothing there. These journeys are long and complicated, right? And like, very infrequently do people. So there's been this like professionalization of startups in like the last bunch of years. Like, Y Combinator did a bunch of this, which is like, kind of, here's the template. You come in with this, you deliver this click stop, this this valuation, that valuation, company, right? And like, that does work every once in a while. Like, I don't want to say that like never works, but it's kind of like creating a production factory line out of it. And what you get when you have a factory line, just like with operations work, is you get a lot of consistent work, right? But you don't get the most interesting shit, right? You get like pretty standard good stuff, right? And like, there are ways to raise the probability of success, right? Like, there are ways to kind of like, if something's more standard, then like on average it will fail less often. That's probably true. But you also don't get like crazy swerves of new shit unless you kind of take more experimental models. And so again, I'm not even critical of like the professionalization of startups in Silicon Valley. I just think like it's worth knowing that like there's not just one way. And like, honestly, I think the most interesting stuff people come to pretty organically.
So Finn, at the beginning, the system thing was purely for fun.
That's an overstatement. It wasn't for fun. Like, we wouldn't raise money and like go off and like work on it if it was like, we think there's a company in this space. Like, we were like, okay, this is like the strike zone. Like, we know this thesis is broadly interesting, and like, we want to build this because we're interested in it, and we think there's going to be interesting companies to build in it. But like, it wasn't like, this is exactly the pitch. I can give you the 2-minute elevator pitch on why this is an amazing business, as opposed to being like, look, human in the loop is clearly the future. That's become passe to say, but when we were saying it, there were a lot of people running around saying like pure AI is the future. And we're like, that's bullshit. Like, do you guys actually know what pure AI looks like right now? Like, no fucking way, right? Like, but like, how you figure out what the opportunities are, I just think you have to be so close to the problems and weirdly obsessed with them that like, you kind of have to start down a path and see where it leads you, right? In one form of entrepreneurship, right? So it could be that like, for people who worked at companies a long time, like, there's a lot of great companies where people taking an internal tool or something, they've been like way over invested in some strange problem, and like they know the answer that no one else gives a shit about or knows about because they've been over invested in it. Like, that's one path, right? But like, you have to generate like some edge beyond like, I'm smart, into like, I weirdly know too much about this one space, right? Or I weirdly have an angle on this that no other smart person would obviously have, or I'm just willing to take a risk no one else would take, right? Is the way I think about company building and actually value building. Like, you need smart people doing random ass shit, right, in order to come up with like the future.
Love it. Thank you.
Awesome. Next we have Adobe.
Hey, so my name's Adobe. I'm speaking from London. I'm working on a product that aims to measure the performance of engineers in real time by collecting data from the different applications they use. And my question is,
a broad problem area I know something about.
So my question to you is, when you started, I started to really focus on Finn and the operations product you're working on now. Sorry, my voice is going a bit. What did your MVP look like, and what was your thought process behind it?
So the MVP was actually the true MVP I built in a hackathon at Finn, where I was just like, I'm sick of not knowing what the operations team is doing. I've never built a Chrome plugin before. Fuck it, can't be that hard. And I basically was just like streaming URLs they were hitting, like, and saving them. And that's useful. It's not that useful, but it's useful. There's some data in there. We then built a bunch of versions internally to service our own needs, right? Like, because we're just like, we need to be able to do better quality assurance and like replay situations when they break. We need to like understand why this process is slow, or if this person's computer is slow. Like, let's just keep building out and building out. And so we built a bunch of tools that they weren't really commercializable because they were like too deeply baked into the rest of what we were doing. But like, it helped us iterate through, MVPs, like things we were using ourselves. Then the question is, what do you actually like? Depends what an MVP is. It's like that was an MVP as an internal tool for Fin. It wasn't like an MVP commercial tool, right? Then we went out to the market and we're like, we have this shit. This stuff's cool. And interestingly, I think in this world, especially the world we're in, unfortunately, the MVPs require so much security and compliance work, right? That like there's like a year of like shit you have to do to get to the start line, right? In terms of security, which makes it really hard to do the traditional consumer thing of like a really small thing that just works. And then you got like, there's a bet you have to make on investing all that time and money and effort in security and compliance. So like actually our MVP that people would buy from us, with the exception of tiny startups that like don't really count in my mind, right, is like SOC 2 compliant and GDPR compliant and has all sorts of fancy encryption shit that like allows you to control your data. Like there's a lot of redaction rules. Like it was basically an iterative process of working with clients, right, who are like, yeah, in theory I want this, but in practice, like we need to check all these boxes and a VSAQ and all this shit. It was pretty complicated. For you, I think like not knowing anything about your product, but just knowing, oh, it's basically productivity measurement stuff for engineers or engineering teams. It's like, I would definitely start with like smaller, like startups or your friends or yourself, right? Just because like, you don't want to deal with all that shit when you're kind of experimenting. But for operations teams, like the reality is not very useful to have operations insight into like a single person, right? Or like 3 people on a startup team, right? They don't have enough processes for it to matter, right? So I don't know, that wasn't really a good answer to your question, but the answer to the MVP was actually pretty complicated.
No, it makes sense. Makes sense. Thank you.
Sure. By the way, I want the engineering productivity tool when you figure out how to make it work. I'll take it.
No worries.
Awesome. Next we have Karen.
Yeah, hi, nice to meet you. So shortly about my startup, it's called Palabra. We basically make an email marketing tool that instead of asking you to segmentize people manually, we take data from all the tools you're using, like Stripe, Intercom, and we segmentize for you, basically.
Nice.
So my question is, as an angel investor, you invested in very cool startups. My question is, was there something in particular that you saw like early on in these startups that convinced you to invest?
Well, the nice part about investing really early in startups is there's really no data, right? Like, and because there's no data, it's like, there's only really 2 things you can invest in, right? Or have a thesis around. One is like the space or the idea, and the other is just the person, right? Like the reality is startups suck. They're really hard. They're like usually not that much fun. They're like generally shitty with moments of great and it feeling great, right? It's a very manic depressive, shitty way to live in a lot of ways, right? And so it's very interesting because you're kind of looking in my mind for angel investing for people who are like sufficiently crazy or sufficiently misfit to want to do startups, really, and they are not like posers, you know what I mean? Like they're just doing it because like it's now the cool thing to do, but like they have to be weird enough to be startup founders, but also like sane enough, right, to like actually build good companies, right? And like I think that's like a very interesting mix. And so I think the reality is like the 2 ways you lose as an early stage investor, there's a lot of ways to lose. In fact, you usually lose, but like let's say the 2 things that are completely critical is when you win, it has to be a big deal because you're mostly going to lose your money. So like when you do make money, right, you have to make a lot of money to make the equation work, which means that like investing in things that are too niche or too small, like you need people like coming up with ideas that are like, if this works, it's fucking huge. Not if this works, it's fine, right? Like, or if this works, it's a good business for the founders. Like it needs to be really big. So it's like, like I was an angel investor in like MakerBot, right? Which was like kind of trying to like consumerize, like make it open up the world of 3D printing to everyone. It's like, that's a huge vision if it works. Turns out it didn't quite work, but like, it's a huge vision. We still made a fair amount of money on it, right? Because they did some cool shit and people got excited about it, but like big vision. And the second is the person. It's like, I don't know, like startups are like, it's been interesting to watch even in my career, which hasn't been that long, but like I graduated from college in 2005. Like I'm getting older, I guess, is like even when I started doing startups, like it wasn't cool. It was like a weird thing to do. And like, there's been this interesting signal to noise problem where like it's become more glamorous or like people are more excited about it, it's more accessible. And because of that, you attract a bunch of people who like aren't sufficiently weird to deal with how weird these journeys are, if that makes sense. So I don't know. I think it's just like it's much. I always like to point out my grandfather, who is awesome, is like almost 90, just retired, and he was a career psychiatrist. And like I do think that like there's some aspect to early stage investing, which is like a combination of like market sizing and psychiatry, right? Which is like I want to understand why the hell you, Karen, who I'm sure are very smart, very capable, could do lots of things, wants to do this, right? And if you understand what you're actually getting yourself in for.
Thank you.
Fair.
Awesome. Next up, we have Azim.
Hi, Sam. My name is Azim, and I'm based in Pakistan. And my company is called TapTap. So it's basically an audio note-taking app. It saves only the most important parts of conversation without saving the whole thing. So So right now I'm pivoting towards Chrome extension, so I can capture Zoom and Hangouts and YouTube stuff. So my question to you is that how to decide about what features you should build in super early days when you have limited information about your users?
I think you just need to get users. I think it's really hard to know what to build without either yourself being the user, right? Which is actually in some ways the ideal case, because you're like, fuck everyone else. Like, I know what I want. And like, if you can have a very pure conversation with yourself about what you want and why you're the user, that's like the easiest. If you're not the user, then you just need to get some users. Like, and just, I do think it's funny I say that candidly, because like, I usually am an advocate of like, stop listening to your users, just build what's right. Like I kind of do believe the faster horse. You guys know the Henry Ford thing everyone quotes. Like if you ask people before the car what they want, they say they want a faster horse. I think that's generally true. Like you can't actually listen to exactly what your users are saying, but you do need something in front of them, I think, and then just to like iterate and see what they want. And then make decisions.
Yeah. So for example, you have an idea about the problem that your users face. So you actually own the problem. The users own the problem, but you own the solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about listening to really closely, and not necessarily listening to what they tell you, but listening to what they're actually saying. You know what I mean, or what they're actually motivated by. Again, this goes back to the whole like I think early stage work in general has this like very deep like psychiatry component to it, which is like you say you want that. Do you actually want that? Or do you actually want this other thing that you don't know how to articulate? Or like you're saying that to me because that's the comfortable thing to say, but it's not what you actually want, right? And like teasing through all that's very important. If you can do that with yourself because you're the user, that is actually in some ways the best, right? Like if you are like, this is the thing I need, I'm building this for myself. I think there are many more people like me and I can do that self-reflection. That's the most efficient. But if you're gonna like, if you don't have that, or you really are building for other people, I think this is a key with like enterprise, which is again, I'm a consumer guy who started to build enterprise stuff. Is like if you're building for business users, you just need a handful of them that are going to be that you can figure out are going to be super invested and super honest with you, and then you need to like listen to partially what they're saying. You know what I mean? Like or like understand the nuance of what they're really saying, not what they're telling you, right? There's I'm always Anyway, we can go down a rabbit hole on that, but like, yeah, I mean, there's no way to know other than that.
Got it. Thank you.
I would also say like one thing I would say to all of you guys, and this is like take this with a grain of salt. We're in such a weird time in like startup history, especially with Corona going on. Like Mohammed or like any of you guys that are building things, like I would strongly urge you guys to figure out how to make money on your tools sooner than later, right? And the reason is like, particularly now, one reason is like no one knows what's going to happen to venture financing in the coming years, and like it's very unclear. Like it's been very clear for a bunch of years how the markets worked, and it's not going to be clear how it will work in the next few years. So you want to be as self-sufficient as possible. The second is like it's actually in some ways the best. Like people, this is kind of a not a great word to use, but humor me. It's like you guys know what like grin fucking is. Right, like there's this idea is like people are like when you're like oh yeah, I love what you're doing, I really like it, or I'll use like, but they're not like they're like oh yeah, this is stupid, right? Or like people like really want to support entrepreneurs, and so they're very likely, especially if you can get with the right people, to like want to give you, you know, promote you or like give you kind of. But the reality is, the second you're like cool, pay me, that's where you actually figure out who's serious about your shit and not, right? And it's like how you create community. So I'm like a big fan in charging for shit. As much as possible early on, both because you need the money and because like it really separates who's serious about what you're doing and who isn't. That helps you focus on the right users, right? Just the thing to consider. It's like Mohammed, I'd be like, I don't know what your tool is, I don't know the details. Like I'm an investor in something called otter.ai, which has a similar like let's record everything and figure out, you know, transcribe it and figure out key moments. You know, there's unless you have like a network tool that needs density, I just be like, cool, you need to do this shit, like pay me, right? Just to like figure out who's serious and who's not.
I'm gonna send you the Chrome link and then ask you to pay me.
You can ask, you can do it. The only problem with the audio recording stuff, Mohammed, is like this is a good example of like it's like I'll try anything. I'll try your tool. It is nerve-wracking to like give someone you don't know. I mean, it's nice that you're in Pioneer. That says more than nothing. But like access to voice streams, you're like, whoa, I have no control over what's going to happen to this. But I'll try it.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Cool. Next up, we have Omar.
Hi, Sam. Great to have you here. I'm Omar.
Nice. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'm based in Berlin, and I work on Monitoro, which extracts data from websites every time they change, and then we send it to other services such as Google Sheets, Slack, you know, even a database, etc. So my question here is, what do you think of creating a startup outside of an existing trend such as machine learning or AI? Like, is that a positive, a negative for experienced investors?
Frame your question again. I'm not sure I fully understand what you're asking.
So typically, you know, like how there are like some massive trends going on in the market, etc. Sure. The current one is machine learning, for example, like on a high level basis. So yeah. What about those projects that do not fall under these trends? You know, in this case, my project, to take it as an example, like we collect data and we send it to other services. So it doesn't fit in any existing exciting kind of quarter for investors or industry. So like, I'm not sure how it is typically seen by people with more experience.
I don't care about it. I mean, look, from a practical perspective, no one gives a shit about trends. From like a user perspective, I'll give you two answers that are the opposite of each other.
Okay, good.
One answer is who the fuck cares? Like your thing is either useful and people use it or not, and like done. And the reality is like, you know, the nice thing about trends is they always come and go and cycle. So as long as you're willing to put the work in and keep building, like it doesn't matter whether you're perfectly catching the trend or not, like in terms of that. So that's the first answer. The second, let me give you a slightly more cynical answer though, which is the opposite, right? The more cynical answer, which I would never even thought of a few years ago, but I think is now something I'm like least conscious of, is it depends whose alignment you need, right? So like really great venture capitalists at the best firms, they don't give a shit. They actually like things that are off trend. Like you want contrarian theses, but there's a lot of venture capitalists or firms that are like, I have 5 buckets and I want the things I invest in to fit into one of these 5 buckets. So like if you just need to raise a bunch of capital, or like you want access to capital markets, yeah, there's some benefit to being quote unquote on trend. Not with the best investors who do not care at all. In fact, they'd rather you be off trend, right? Because like that's where the biggest money is made, right? And the biggest successes are the things that aren't cool. Like if everyone's looking at it, it's almost by definition less cool. But that's like one thing. Here's the other thing that comes to mind though, which again, I'm only starting to understand myself. Like this is like a new thing I'm starting to really internalize, is if you have to sell corporate buyers on a thing, right, as opposed to like individual users, there is a reality of organizational politics where it's just like someone has like an innovation budget, or they have like a machine learning budget or some shit. And like, if you can fit into that budget, they can buy it. And if you don't fit into that budget, they can't. Right. And so there is this like attention cycle thing. It's pretty annoying. Like, I don't like this, but I do think it's real, right, for enterprise stuff. So I don't know. Like my general advice is like, fuck the trend. Like the trend always changes anyway, and like just build good shit and don't worry about it. But I do think there's like a slightly more nuanced and cynical version of the answer to your question, which is like, yes, with an asterisk, which is like, unless you are really concerned about broad access to venture capital, where I do think there's a lot of investors like, I am a machine learning investor. Do you have machine learning? And you're like, no. And you're like, I don't understand. I do machine learning. And you're like, fuck you. Right. And then the other is, I think corporate buyers, there is like a life cycle too, which, you know, is a fascinating subculture that like doesn't sound like it's relevant to you, but like if you're trying to sell big enterprises, like theme kind of does weirdly matter. In which case, what you basically have to do is you take your tool and you just say, you like just say the buzzword, and they're like, oh, this fits in my budget, and then you're good.
Yeah, right. I actually
do you have
sort of a...
do you have AI? And you're like, yes, I have AI. Oh, great, we love AI. You're like, okay, wonderful.
So I'm not trying to attract these kind of people. This is why I was asking, like, you know,
and who cares?
Making sense. Or, yeah, exactly.
Then who cares? I mean, I think the reality, the best investors and the best people hate the things that are on trend because they're bored. Everyone's looking at them, right? Like you want to do the thing. Right. The number one thing people look for is the opposite of the thing.
Okay, cool. I kind of have a follow-up question here. So like during this crisis, right? Like you spoke about the uncertainty of the market, etc. Do you think it is wiser to target, let's say, cost centers, so trying to reduce efforts for cost centers in larger companies, or is it to increase profit for profit centers? Like, what would be a more winning strategy in your opinion?
So again, I wouldn't argue that I'm like the most sophisticated enterprise thinker. Like I'm a consumer guy who's learning about enterprise and doing more in the space and like prosumer and whatever else. In general, it's always better to make people money than save people money in general, right? Because the reality is you can only save a certain amount of money. Like if your budget is X, you can only save a percentage of X. Whereas if you're making people money, you can make them infinity money, right? And making infinity money is always better than like something with an upper bound attached to it. That said, there's no question that like right now we're in a cycle where like people do care a lot about cost control and efficiency, and they're very nervous about how to manage those things. And so like there's more receptivity for those types of stories than there was a year ago, where people were like, I don't care about costs, I just want to grow. But again, I wouldn't get too much into the strategery of it, honestly. I think one mistake that early stage builders make sometimes, once they like, you have the really naive early stage builders who are just building their thing, and like they're generally building stupid shit, but every once in a while they're building something super cool, right? Then you have the people who are like more sophisticated or like have access to a community, and especially if you talk to people who care too much about business, they start getting obsessed with like the strategery of startups. What's the market? How, you know, like all this shit, and like it's fine, it's a helpful tool set, but like don't let that guide you. You know what I mean? Like if you let that guide you, you'll end up building generally worse stuff, is my understanding. It's like if the thing you're building is fundamentally good for cost cutting or for efficiency, then let it be that, right? If it's fundamentally good for what, then do that. Like don't let what's marginally better story
so kind of growing it organically.
That's where the best successes are. I mean, I think, again, just to keep riffing, like there's this other thing I just keep in mind, which is like a whole philosophy of startups. Like, what are you guys all doing it for? Like, there's a way to manage risk, right? And like make sure the thing you're building is worth at least something and is at least somewhat valuable. And there's a way to like build really big things, right? And like they're two pretty different mentalities. If you want to go for the build really big things, you have to take bigger leaps. You have to be willing to fail more often, or you have to be able to blow it up more often, or like just, you know, and that's a really tough emotional thing to deal with. But it is where the great magic comes versus like there's lots of ways to manufacture pretty good software, which finds some sort of market and does fine, right? But it does inform which of those, like, are you following a market? Or are you just doing oddball shit? Like, whatever.
Right. Okay, thank you for these insights.
Cool. Next we have Yura.
Hi, Sam. I'm Yura from Ukraine. I work on software robots that automate humans' work with software.
The RPA landscape.
Yeah. I paid $10 to read your article prediction for the next decade.
Oh, cool.
Specifically the concept humans cloud. But
as I said, always get paid.
Yeah. But there were just a couple sentences about it. So can you explain in more details with examples on these cases about this human cloud concept?
Sure. I mean, the human cloud concept for me is pretty simple, which is like, I mean, again, if you paid $10 and read my article, you probably know this, but like for everyone else, it's like, look, you think about humans doing shit in general, like just making things. And if you think about the physical world, we went from things being very not process managed, like you're a cobbler, there's like a bunch of cobblers, you're all making shoes differently. You kind of inform how you're doing. Maybe there's a guild and they kind of share knowledge, but it's like very ad hoc, right? And what happened in physical production is we got really, really good at dialing it, right? Measuring it, right? Creating structured processes, discovering the best process, applying that process, specializing labor. We did all this shit. And we've gotten pretty good at making stuff. Then you turn around and look at knowledge workers or people doing any sort of like work in front of a computer or queue-based work, and it's a fucking mess, right? It's like the process control sucks, measurement sucks. And as a result, there's like very low efficiency compared to what there could be. Like we do all the measurement stuff, so I feel like very exposed to how inefficient humans are. It's not that they want to do a bad job. Everyone wants to do a good job, broadly speaking. Like it's just that like the whole frameworks and tools aren't there to like make people more efficient and help them be more efficient and offload things that can be automated. There's no production facilities. Like it just doesn't, it's very loosely done. And so I think we're in the stage where like historically, it's pretty easy to think about how to optimize a factory line, right? Especially you get a stopwatch, you sit there, you watch what people are doing, you write it down. It's not that many steps. It's pretty easy to measure and instrument and therefore optimize. Knowledge works super hard. It's like you have to figure, like it's much more nuanced. What is the person doing every second? Where's the time going? What can you actually automate? What's repeatable? What's not? It's like, it's very complicated, right? And so the good news is we now have the fundamental ability to store data and process data and like, manage technology that allows us in theory to start systematizing and automating it and, turning it more into production facilities effectively with efficiency than we've had before. But we're still pretty early in that journey. And so like, I think what we're building at Fin and like what I'm spending a lot of time on is like effectively the stopwatches, right? It's like understanding what is going on and building the data sets and providing that process insight. There are other people, like a lot of the RPA players that, and it sounds like what you're working on, like you got to build the tools. Like you don't need humans doing everything. Like if anything, if a machine can do it, then why would you want a human to do it? Humans are more expensive. They're a more precious resource, right? Like, you basically just need all those metaphors in the knowledge workspace, right? Is the way I think about it. Now, who builds those machines? What platforms exist? How you update that? Like there's a whole bunch of really interesting questions about what like the future of RPA and these machines actually look like and how they're managed. But there's clearly a space there, right? Like that's happening. And I think there's a lot more innovation to come than we've seen already.
And how it's different from Amazon Mechanical Turk?
So a few things. The way I think about Mechanical Turk is like, first of all, it's fascinating, but there's this whole pipeline. Think of a human as like a processor, right? And version 0 is you have like the very generic processor that you can't really load instructions into, right? It's just like you get like a tiny amount of buffer. It's like this, you can do very basic things with it, right? That are still cool, but like you can't customize its work very much or control its work very much. Like that's what Mechanical Turk is, right? Like you can basically upload into the processor a tiny number of commands, which have to fit like on one web page with a simple form. And then the processor can execute just that, and then do it over and over and over in these micro tasks. Most work is more complicated than that, right? Most work, even if you're doing a really good job with your infrastructure and how you're carving up the tasks, like it requires context, like there's all this other shit. So you think about computer metaphors, like you just need to load more instructions, right? And loading instructions is expensive because like the person has to fucking read them, right? Like you have to do all this stuff around them. And so I just think in terms of like reputation and specialization of who's good at what, and like there's like a bunch of things of infrastructure that means that Mechanical Turk is like kind of the right base layer, but like the number of things you can actually carve up and do with Mechanical Turk is extremely low because of the limitations of kind of a lot of the kind of infrastructure around the person, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's too abstract, but like basically I just like, it's fine. It's like the most basic way to leverage a human, right? But like there's a reason people get paid almost nothing on it, right? Which is like by definition everyone can do it and the instructions are super simple, right? And like the reality is like the second you start accounting for, you know, the identity of people, their reputation, what they do and don't, what instructions are already loaded, the cost of loading those instructions, how you validate answers, like it gets much more interesting. That's before you get to like all the security and other policy concerns around this stuff, which is like a whole other dimension to like why not all people are the same, right?
Thank you. Interesting concept.
Cool. Awesome. Next up, we have Jordan.
Hey, Sam.
What's up, Jordan?
Hey, I'm in the UK. I'm working on a human-in-the-loop AI startup.
You guys are all working on stuff I care about. Is that because there are tons of pioneers, but only a few of you showed up? Or is it like pioneer thing, like just doing things I generally think are interesting?
That was the theme, yeah. Okay. So you started with Finn, like the assistant, mostly humans. Then you did the analytics. Now it's Finn analytics, and it seems to be mostly analytics on top of humans. So how are you thinking about where does AI come in? Is that something you're going to be doing as your company, or is you happy to?
People ask us about it. Here's the answer. We have a really fucking cool data set that's extremely well set up for doing some really fancy AI shit with, right? However, we're a very pragmatic company, and the reality is like the places where AI like gives you huge leverage on the overall question, which is how do I make my operations team more efficient and higher quality? It's like, it's not generally the right tool right now, right? Like it's what people think. Like you go to a buyer and all people are like, I want the AI so that I can be more efficient. You're like, well, we can give you the AI, but you don't really want the AI because if you look at these 16 opportunities, there's like 15 ways that we can dramatically improve your performance before we get into that fancy shit. You know, it's like so basically the way I put it is like, before we talk about AI, why don't we start by like counting shit properly and like fixing the fact that 5% of your cases are costing you like 35% of your entire operations budget. Or like, let's fix the fact that like when I look at the curve of your operational efficiency, like, you know, your average occupancy of humans even having the opportunity to work on the core thing they're supposed to be doing versus meta work is like a yield of like 35 or 40%, which is like pretty realistic for a lot of organizations. So it's like, I think there's this thing which is technology, and it's a really hard thing, is like technologists want to work on cool technology, right? And so especially if you come from a technology background, you're like, I want the coolest fucking shit. And the coolest shit is like running some crazy machine learned AI cluster that discovers automatically the blah, blah. And you're like, that's sweet. And like, but like, let's be real. Like when you turn over and you're building a company with business, you're like, look, business people, like you spend $100 million on us. Would it be sweet if instead you spent 75? And they're like, yes. And you're like, cool. And they're like, can you do it with AI? And you're like, I can, and it will take me 15 times longer and be more confusing. Or the AI will get you 5 million, or like basic counting will get you 30. They're like, let's start with the basic counting, right? So it's like, I don't know. There are problems that require these massive leaps. Like you're not going to get self-driving cars with basic counting, right? Just to like be silly about it. Like you do need to like take the leap. But I think for a lot of practical business things, it's like what I always think about is like do something good with an option on AI. don't just do the AI because it's awesome. I'd also point out, just this is a fun historical anecdote about AI, which you can tell I'm a little bit silly and cynical about, is, you know, the definition of AI changes based on where technology ever is at any given point. Like in the night, everything we do, everything would be considered AI like 50 years ago. Like our entire lives are AI, right? And my favorite example of this is like so my hero is a guy named Claude Shannon. I'm actually curious, do you guys know who Claude Shannon is?
Yes.
Okay. Shannon's the fucking coolest guy ever. He invented information theory. You should look him up. It's awesome what he's my idol. But he basically invented, I would argue, like he's like the most important person in modern computer science. And I think in the modern world, like full stop, like wait, but we can get into that another day. In the 1950s, he made, at the time, something incredibly groundbreaking, which was this little project called Theseus. It was a mouse that basically was able to run a maze and find a piece of magnetic cheese, right? Like, and this is the type of thing that, like, honestly, like, you program in 3rd grade now. But at the time, this was fucking mind-blowing to people. And he was on the cover of Time magazine. The article was the arrival of AI, because the mouse could find the cheese, right? And so that's what AI was. And like there were conferences about it. This was a big fucking deal. And it was considered AI. And so the thing I just keep in mind when we talk about AI is what we're really talking about is like whatever is currently at the edge of feeling almost magical in the space of computer science, right? And there will always be AI, and it will always be a few years or maybe a decade ahead of what we can do now, or the coolest thing we can do now. So like I get super cynical when people are like, it's AI. I'm like, well, what does it do? Is it just it's machine learning? Well, that's cool. Like there are branches of it. That's cool. But like, all right, I'm done being an asshole about that.
Okay, awesome.
Cool, thanks. Next we have Brad.
Hey, how's it going? I'm Brad from Iowa, and I'm working on a company called RoboFlow that makes computer vision easy for everyday developers to use without being experts in machine learning.
Sweet.
So my question is, we've built this like rapidly and kind of like with a consumer mindset to like get users and test things, but now we're having like corporate customers come through the door, and like in talking to them, they're asking for things like they want it on premises. And so I have 2 questions. First, like I feel like when I'm talking about this stuff with them, I feel like I'm bullshitting because I don't even know what I'm like, what do they want from on-prem? How do you do that? So first, tactically, like what's the best way to learn about how to do that, or like even what the process is? And second, strategically speaking, I'd be interested in thoughts on like whether we should just kind of like forego those customers for now so that we can focus on making a great product for the customers that it serves, or if we should be figuring out how to have an on-prem solution so that we can sell to these really big enterprises.
Fucking on-prem. So a few thoughts. One is historically never ever startups shouldn't do on-prem. It's just annoying to manage and too much and like stupid, right? Like to like have to be like sitting on. Now, the caveat on that is with lots of fun with things like Kubernetes, like there are now ways to, in theory, package and do things on-prem that aren't heinous, right? And so like it's something you should at least look into and learn about is like, how would you does your application and your stack fit in a way that it's easy for you to manage on-prem deployments, right? And like offer that as a service. You know, it's basically a shortcut to security is what it is, right? And there are a bunch of companies that just like won't touch the cloud, right? That are big enterprises. The people who generally won't touch the cloud are generally the hardest customers in general, because the fact that they won't touch the cloud comes with a bunch of other shit, right? Where it's like, it's kind of like it's like a flag where it's like, if you will not allow this, use a cloud-based application, then there's probably 50 other things about your organization that are going to make them a nightmare to deal with. That's not 100% fair. Like I can make exceptions to that, but like I would just keep that in mind. In terms of whether or not to like talk to people who like big enterprises versus whatever, it depends whether you have like a core audience that you're excited about that isn't that. If you don't, right, then like, sure, talk to them. Make sure they're paying you, because it's a really good indication of how serious they are, right? Like what you don't want is like some junior person who like happens to find your technology and thinks it's kind of hot, but really has no decision-making power, right? And can't really write checks, right? To be like, sweet, come work with us, but then you waste a bunch of time building shit for a client that can't buy from you. You know, on the flip side, it's like if there are like 4 companies that are like, we'll give you a fuckload of money and like just make sure you can support us, and you're like, and I don't really have another market, then like you're building an enterprise company, and that's cool. I will say, I mean, you know, I don't know how much you guys have looked into like, or know about like some of you working on RPA, like RoboCorp and Robot Framework and what those guys are doing. This is like my biggest RPA investment. I'm really excited about it. But they've done a really interesting job, I think, of managing cloud plus on-prem. Where like, whatever, you should look into it if you're interested. But it's like basically, how do you run local agents with like a cloud backend that seems like people can be very comfortable with in the enterprise?
Do you have any suggestions on like where to go learn that stuff? So like when I Google it, I get like a bunch of articles about like what is on-prem, but like nothing like actually useful.
As with, here's the reality is like, as with like, there's, as far as I've ever found, there's no resource that you should trust on this stuff. On the like most things, like really good information actually isn't on the internet, right? For almost anything, with the exception of some technical stuff, right? Because knowing this shit's actually really valuable, right? And like there aren't like, so like why would it be posted publicly in a trustable way? Or how do you know what's true and what's not true? I mean, I think the best advice I'd have for you, and you could use Pioneer Network to figure this out, I'm sure, work with me, is like, you just need to find someone who's been through this cycle before, who you like and trust and can kind of guide you through it a little bit. You know, they should be someone who have some experience as a founder or doing sales and the technical side. But like, you know, the reality is like most good information is still not public. Like you're not going to like Google like, should I do an on-prem deployment as a startup or whatever, and get any sort of meaningful information out of that, right? Like, and it's also very personal. Like you're going to have context on your specific situation, which no one else really has, right? So I do think this is a place where like really good mentorship of people who have actually done exactly it before would be good. Don't go like find some like salesperson at some big company, even if they have a cool resume, because like they don't actually know, right? Like you need someone who's like technical, done something like this before. Like I would pick a bunch of companies that you're like, wow, like they probably dealt with this already, or they went through exactly this, and see if Pioneer can hook you up with the CEOs.
Cool, thanks.
Cool. I think we probably have time for one more question here. Jay, go ahead. Round 2. All
right. Just back to you were mentioning the psychiatry of founders earlier, right? Just wanted to quickly get your opinion. What's your profile of a successful founder? Is it risk taker? Is it like the classic insecure overachiever? What profile do you have in mind?
I don't think there's like a single. So I don't think I have a single profile, but here's a few things to keep in mind. One is, I think there is this thing about connection to the problem, which matters a lot. Like in the professionalization of startups, we went from a world where people who were doing startups were doing them because like they had to see it in the world. They're like so passionate about it. It was like the only thing, it was like the reason for being, they had some like personal reason why like they were overly obsessed about some specific small thing, right? Like, or a specific thing, period. And like no one else cared or whatever, but they were like super obsessed with it for whatever reason. That might be, and so like I think that personal connection is good. What's happened is, and this is part of like, again, with professionalization of startups, is you now have a bunch of people doing things from startups that like, they're pretty good business ideas, but you're like, do you even really give a shit about this? Like, I know it's a good business idea. I know it's a good pitch, but like, why are you doing this, right? Like I sometimes ask myself this question. It's like, why am I working on fin analytics? It's like, do I have a really good reason for it? It's like, I have a reason, I have a self-justification for why I'm interested in it. And like, it's partially about like, I am kind of obsessed with measurement and back to like my Bain days and da-da-da-da. I also really, really believe in like, that productivity is the only way forward, right? Like for the American workforce and things like that. So I have this like high-minded framework about why analytics and measurement is like the central thing that must happen with technology to like keep the world working well. But it's like, it's not like it like massively deeply affects me in some personal way. And I do think that if it did, it would be easier, right? And like, I think there's like a whole thing where it's like, you have to like, I think be introspective first with yourself, but it's like, is there a really good reason I'm working on this? Because if it's just like, I think it's a good way to make money, it's not impossible to build successful companies, but it's harder, right? Like it can't just be, in my mind, I think it's really hard for it just to be about money. And then I think the psychology thing is like, look, you know, there's being a startup founder is kind of egotistical, right? Like you are going to have to go through all these things where like convincing people to work with you in hard situations, and like you have to be resilient enough. Like there's all this. I mean, I'm a huge believer that like grit is the most important thing. It's like, have you been knocked down before, and will you get back up? Because there are plenty of people who like are great on paper, but like if you knock them down, they've never had to stand back up. They've been so successful in their lives that like they just have never experienced failure, and like they don't know what it means to come back from that. And like if you're starting a company, you're going to fail at shit, and you're going to break shit, and you're going to get sued. There's going to be all this shit that's going to happen in your life you have to get through, right? And like you just want to know what people are like when that happens, right? So I don't know. It's not like I have some like the things I say is like people who are like complete overachievers and have never failed at anything, and they just have gone from success to success, and they have pristine resumes. They're usually not great startup founders, right? You know, but again, like it's really personal, and it's like a hard thing. It's kind of like the question about how do you learn about, you know, managing enterprise deployments on blah, blah, blah. It's kind of like part of it is you need to find people who have just done a lot of it. And then two is like you just have to do a lot of it yourself to learn firsthand and pattern match about who you, and then you're going to be wrong a bunch, right? Like even once you've done all that, like again, early stage investing, you're like most of the time you're wrong.
Awesome, thanks.
All right, Sam. Fantastic. Thank you so much.
This is fun, guys. If I could be helpful, I'm Lessin on everything, Gmail and Twitter and whatever the fuck else. So feel free to message me.
Perfect.
Cheers.
Right,
bye, guys.
Thank you again.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jackson. See you tomorrow.
See y'all.
Jackson.